Solutions to the Dropout Crisis, addressing the dropout crisis one strategy at a time. Brought to you by the National Dropout Prevention Center Network with support from K-12 and in partnership with Clemson Broadcast Productions. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome once again to Solutions to the Dropout Crisis. You're probably looking at this set right now and say, have I got the right place? But yes, you do. Solutions has a whole new look and a whole new mission that we're going to be starting to share with you today. But first, I'd just like to introduce my forever co-host, Karen Withington, almost forever co-host. It's good to have you here again on this debut of something really special here with Solutions.
Thank you, Marty. I am very excited to be here for this first showing of our new set and all the new news we have to tell our viewers.
I know. I mean, we have lots of new news. Let's start with the biggie, which is our new sponsor. And that's K-12, which is a company that you're going to learn more about. But basically, they are into helping all students using technology by both digital learning, online learning, and blended learning.
Right.
So,
and you know, the Dropout Prevention is all about, Center is all about having options for students. And so K-12 and other organizations can provide those options, alternative learning environments, and the educational technology that can help students.
Right, and we're really pleased to have them in their sponsorship of taking Solutions to the next level. And this means going on the road. So tell us a little bit about those plans, Karen.
Right, with our new sponsorship, we're going to actually be able to take Solutions to events where there are practitioners working in the field doing great things for dropout prevention, intervention, recovery, and also events where researchers and policymakers are presenting and there's networking going on, and we can bring that to the viewers now from those mobile locations.
Yeah, this is going to be such an exciting new era for Solutions, and I'm kind of happy to be part of that movement for sure.
Yes, yes, yes.
We're reaching out to all you all out there and just getting some good information and doing even a better job than we've done in the past 8 years, right?
That's the plan.
Right. Besides going to all these different conferences throughout the country, Karen, what else can you tell us about what's coming up with the National Dropout Prevention Center?
Oh, well, these are going to be some great events that we have coming up during the next year. Our biggest events that I want to tell our viewers about. June 26th through 29th, we'll be down very near Orlando, Florida, in Kissimmee, Florida, with our Hope for the Wounded Student conference, and it's based on information about trauma-informed strategies to help struggling students who have experienced some type of trauma. And that's a wonderful conference. That's June 26th through 29th. That is open now if you are a presenter who would like to present at that. We have a limited call for presentations right now, and the hotel is open for reservations, and we'll be soon getting up our online registration to come to that conference. And then in October 2nd through 5th is our largest conference of the year. Every year we have a network conference, National Dropout Prevention Network Conference. This year we're going to be in Detroit, Michigan, and October 2nd through 5th again, 2016, Detroit, Michigan, and the topic, or one of the main things we're going to do there that's really exciting, we're going to have a lot of student involvement. We're going to focus a lot on student engagements and ways to hear from the students as to their agenda and what can help them.
Well, I tell you, having students at the conference will add a lot of life and enthusiasm to what is always a great event. Looking forward to that one.
Very much.
Absolutely. Well, now we're going to focus on what we're going to do today, which on Solutions we're going to look at something that's really important, and that's early identification of students who are at risk. And you know, there's that saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Well, that's what early identification and early interventions is all about. And Karen went to the At-Risk Forum in February, and she met with Dr. Mariam Azin, who is an expert in this area of early identification, early warning systems, and so we're excited about that topic because if you intervene early, Karen, you can head off a lot of the problems that happen later on. Mm-hmm. And I think in this discussion today, which I've seen, I think we're going to learn a lot about that.
Right. This is really dropout prevention. I
Yes.
mean, the early indicators, finding out what those are, and then what do you do about it? How do you intervene there? But early identification and preventing. The topic is early intervention and early warning intervention, reaching students before anything major happens.
So there are early signs, and that's what's interesting to a lot of people teaching in the elementary grades, that they actually have a role in this whole continuum. It's not just when someone turns 16, all of a sudden, I hate school, I'm out of here. That didn't just happen. So we're going to learn about that today, and how you, no matter what grade level you're in, can play a role in helping a student stay on track, and what schools and districts can do to identify those students at an early stage. Like all our solutions programs, Karen, this is for professional development, and is only the beginning of schools and teachers and communities learning about new issues. And so to follow up after today's broadcast, we want to direct you to the web page where the resources are listed. And there's some mighty fine ones there, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yes, yes. At dropoutprevention.org/webcast. Right on this page where you're watching this, there are some resources that you can get more information and dig deeper on the topic for today.
And if you want to join a discussion on this, on that same web page, we have a discussion board, which the likes of I, can just type right in and get our little thoughts on the matter, questions. Our presenter can weigh in on the matter, as well as all your colleagues across the country. And then there's the really up-to-date way to get in communication, and that's through Twitter, Karen, right?
Right. If you tweet and you'd like to be in a conversation with us on today's topic or any topic, you can tweet at NDPCN, #early warning for today's topic. We also have a Facebook page, and we can have a discussion on Facebook.
Yes, so the gates are open for lots of conversation and lots of new learning. That's what we hope to stimulate today, is some new learning and some change.
Dr. Mariam Azin is president of Planning Research Evaluation Services, Prez Associates, and she was at the At-Risk Youth National Forum in Myrtle Beach just last month, and along with lots of wonderful presenters. But I was able to sit down with her for an hour or 45 minutes on this topic and have her go through some of the things you, as a school district, you'd want to look for in an early warning system, some of the reasons students can fall through the gaps if you don't find them early, and what do you need to think about to have in place to take care of students who are identified as having something that needs attention.
And, in addition to this being an extremely important topic, this is an example of the first solutions on the road. So we're kind of excited about putting this show together for everybody today. And so I think without further ado, everybody's ready now to start learning about these early identification and interventions for student at risk. So let's go with Karen now to Myrtle Beach and see what happened at the forum.
Hello, I'm Karen Withington from the National Dropout Prevention Center. I'm on the road with Solutions to the Dropout Crisis at the 2016 National At-Risk Youth Forum in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I'm here today with a guest, Dr. Mariam Azin. Dr. Azin, thank you for joining us today on Solutions.
Happy to be here.
So we want to start, I want to ask you to kind of talk about how students can fall through the cracks and how early intervention efforts can work with some of the efforts schools are already doing.
Sure. Early warning, basically, the whole premise behind that is, for example, dropping out. It's a result of a long process of disengagement from school. So it's not really an event prior to any major negative event happening. And that refers to dropping out or an expulsion or any of these major negative events, there's usually warning signs for years in advance.
Right.
And so that's really the premise behind early warning. You know, to
There's
apply
signs.
Exactly, there are signs, and to try and approach things in a more proactive manner. The other thing is that, you know, in terms of how it fits with broader school initiatives and things like that, you know, I work with a lot of districts and states where they put in a lot of evidence-based interventions, and which are critically important, you know, to provide support to those students when they're starting to show signs of risk.
Yes.
But you have to make the key to those having the impact you want to have is that you have to make sure those interventions reach the students who really need them at the point in time where they're starting, you know, in a timely manner. And if you don't do that, you're not going to have the impacts. And so a good example of this is if I look at this slide. So I was the evaluator on a federal Safe Schools Healthy Students grant. So a lot of times what I've had to do in my work is, you know, evaluate the impacts of all these evidence-based programs and say, you know, what impact did they have? So I work with states or districts, and they're putting millions of dollars into all these evidence-based programs, but they're not seeing an impact. And some of the reasons behind this, common patterns that I've seen, is illustrated in this slide. So one district that I was working with, they had a major issue with substance use. So based on all the prevalence statistics, their youth risk behavior survey and all of that, it suggested that about 30% of their students could benefit from this Project Success program. They were putting hundreds of thousands of dollars into this program called Project Success, where they had substance use counselors embedded into the schools and so forth to provide services. When we went in to evaluate this program, we saw that, you know, so out of the 2,500 students in this high school, approximately maybe 750 would have benefited from the services from this program. When we went in, we saw that actually only 10 referrals had been made to the Project Success counselors.
Oh, 10 out of 750.
150, yeah, exactly. And then of those, only 5 actually connected to the services of the counselor, and only 3 successfully completed the intervention as it was defined.
Okay.
So what I've always been asked to do is say, you know, what impact did Project Success have on those students? And, you know, I can say, well, you know, it had a good impact, a positive impact on the 3 who completed it. But the reason you're not seeing any sort of effect on your school level statistics, your district level statistics, is because you only got it to a fraction of the students who could benefit from it.
Right.
And
Even
so,
though the 750 were identified, were they
well,
identified?
they were
They
basically
weren't
based on the
identified, they
prevalence
could have.
statistics.
Yes, gotcha.
And that's the big thing. That's why you want to put in an early warning
Could
or
have been
a
identified.
systematic infrastructure. So are you getting the interventions connected to those who could benefit from them? And this is where a lot of students fall through the cracks. So they're either not, those who could benefit from it are not being identified. And early, you know, early is also a key thing here. So are they identified when they're starting to show signs of risk, you know, in the beginning? And then if they are being identified, are they getting connected to services and so forth? And so you can have someone falling through the cracks each of those
And maybe
ways.
the earlier the interventions are less intensive, it might be as very effective.
Absolutely. There was a federal report from the U.S. Department of Education, Early Warning, Timely Response, and it talks about basically the key to supporting students who are showing signs of risk, right? And this is risk of academic failure, dropping out, but you know, all areas of risk are really very related, and we'll talk about that. That a key is rapid, efficient, response and support to students when they're starting to show signs of risk, and that if you can provide those services earlier on at the Tier 2 level, you're going to be, first of all, it'll be less resource intensive, but you'll also be, it'll have a greater likelihood of having positive outcomes.
Well, you know, you hear from schools that we know who our students are who are at risk. How does that play into? Do people know that 750? Do they know? You know they say that.
Sure. And I
They.
hear that a lot. We know who our students are. You know, we don't need. You know, we know our kids, and we know who are. And I think that people truly believe they are catching everyone. But the other thing is we're not aware of what we do not notice. And a lot of times and I'll kind of be showing this, when you look at how risk manifests itself, it tends to be very subtle in the beginning. So
Right.
not things that would typically be on someone's radar.
Right.
And that by the time they kind of garner attention, they've already kind of gotten to a point of intensity,
Yes.
which you know,
Yeah.
you could have intervened earlier, and we'll
Maybe
talk
that
about
classroom teacher is the person who maybe noticed some of the subtle things going on
that. Absolutely.
before they start showing up in some of the
Absolutely,
data
absolutely.
that it's collected.
So if I
now.
talk about like how does early warning fit in regards to a kind of broader dropout prevention framework, right?
Right,
When I look about if you're trying to put in infrastructures to promote graduation, academic success, all of these other things. A key here is strengthening kind of early identification and connection to services when the kids are starting to show signs of risk. So what are the parts of that? Early warning and identification. And the big thing here is that a lot of times you'll see a huge amount of variability across schools in the extent to which they identify students for services, the criteria they're being used, and so forth.
Right.
And to the extent that it's that variability exists, a lot of times it can be subjective or anecdotal. Kids can tend to fall through the cracks, and we've seen that a lot in our work.
Some examples of what are you talking about, the differences?
Oh, so here we go. So for example, I've worked in districts before where there are multiple middle schools, for example, if we talk about that, and where, for example, as part of the projects we were doing, they had mentoring programs as one of their evidence-based strategies for these to help their students at risk. And so the supposedly high-performing middle school that was, had less challenges in terms of, their demographics and some of the issues kind of in the broader community it was residing in, had that mentoring program fully loaded to capacity and a wait list.
Yeah.
And then the kind of low performing school, the one that was supposedly more at risk, really only
They weren't
had
taking advantage of it.
weren't taking advantage of it. So that the key is that there has to be an infrastructure for support, and that's really what this kind of talks about. So talking about infrastructure, you have to have an infrastructure systematic for early warning identification, and then what's done with that information. What's your
Right.
infrastructure? And that's really where the rubber meets the pavement. So what happens after you identify students who
Right.
need it? So a process for referral and follow-up. And then you have to have your evidence-based interventions in place, and ongoing monitoring. And then, if you look at that, what's going to happen? You're going to increase access and connection to services and support to those who really need it, and hopefully improve your implementation fidelity. Are they getting really what you thought? And then you'll have improvement in academic outcomes, behavioral outcomes, suspensions, expulsions, student well-being. I mean, all these areas of risk are related. And so by really putting into place a systematic infrastructure like this, you're addressing multiple school goals.
Right.
Graduation as well as school safety and climate and all of these things.
Short term, intermediate, and then really long term.
Part of it too, one of the
outcomes.
moderating factors though, so you asked about why those students weren't identified or referred, is that there's some moderating factors that can influence that, and that is one major one is kind of schools' policies and culture in relation to early intervention. So in that particular district, the reason why referrals weren't being made to the project success counselors are that people were afraid that those kids would be expelled.
I see.
So-
So you have to look at all the things that may be hindering or barriers to being able to identify and provide services.
Absolutely. There had to be a discussion between what is the relationship between our disciplinary policies and our support, and those are all items that are operating,
Yeah.
under the radar, even if they haven't been discussed openly, and are affecting whether students get services or not. Yeah.
How early is? Are we? How early is early? What do you mean with early intervention?
Oh, how early do you start showing signs of risk? and things like that?
Exactly.
Sure. I have a good example of this. So as part of our research, my company has done a lot of work with embedding early warning systems in districts across the country, and we did analyses on over 200,000 students. And we looked at over 36,000 students who dropped out in 10th grade. And this slide, Diary of a Teenage Dropout, kind of shows the profiles of these students at each grade level. So all of the students in here, they eventually dropped out at 10th grade, and it shows what they look like at 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade. And so if you look at this, you see some really interesting patterns. And I've seen this very consistently across virtually every district I've worked with. So here's that. Starting in 3rd grade, you're starting to show signs of risk. But typically what it does is it shows up in one area in a very subtle way. So here, in this case, 92% attendance. Well, people might be like, well, that's nothing to worry about. But actually for a 3rd grader, that's pretty risky.
Right. And you might
Right?
even look at 2nd, 1st kindergarten.
Oh, absolutely.
But like you said, it's going to be not a multiple amount of indicators there. But there might be one
It'll
that's very
typically, what
serious.
we're seeing here, if we look at this diary, is that risk, what it'll do, it'll typically show up in one area, maybe in a very subtle way.
Right.
But that if unaddressed, it'll spread in breadth, intensity, and frequency. So here, for example, it started to show up in attendance. Then you're seeing over here, we're starting to see it in behavior, right? So 2 behavioral incidents and a suspension. Then we're going into academics here, right? And then dropping out eventually. So looking at this student, could you see? It was a long process of disengagement here. There's some key things that you look at here. So first of all, how it manifests in an individual student might vary. So it might first start up in behavior. Then it starts to spread into attendance and things like that. But first of all, the interrelationship between all these signs of risk. It'll show up in one area, it'll spread into other areas. The other thing, are there some really key points in time for intervention? So a lot of times you hear early warning systems start at 8th or 9th grade.
Oh, right.
So let's look at where the student was at 8th or 9th grade. By 8th or 9th grade, all of the bells and whistles are going off.
Yes. There's a lot of, that's a bigger list.
Oh, absolutely, right? And but here, and that's the key, that the profile of a risky 3rd grader is very different
Exactly.
and much more subtle than that of a risky 9th grader. And you can't use this one size fits all
Right.
to identify.
And the subtleties, you really need to look into the
Absolutely. So, this is risky for a 3rd grader, but what's risky for a 9th grader is very different. The other thing that the implication is that there are really some critical points. And what I've seen across all the, districts we're working with is this middle school, 6th, 7th grade, is a really critical time because they're starting to have this show signs of disengagement, but it's a point where they can.
You can still do something about it and make some big
I think you can
impact.
do something, throughout, but things seem to be dropping off dramatically.
Yes,
You
yeah.
can see that there's an intent, it's getting more intense here. So, exactly. The other part on talking about this, the implication of it is, how this fits within a tiered support model. So you hear a lot of districts who have tiered intervention in place.
Right. That's
Right.
a common way to approach services.
Absolutely. So this is the tiered support model with, universal interventions being given to all students, which is at the, level tier 1. Tier 2 interventions here, which that's, tier 2 interventions should be given to students who are starting to show signs of risk. And a little more targeted support. And tier 3 interventions are more intense services for students who are kind of showing really high levels of risk. What we've seen is that there's a tendency that we're really good at identifying students at the tier 3 level. Tier 3, tier 3.5 and above. Those are students who are at the point where you have to pay attention to that and so forth. But the students in need of services at the tier 2 level are notoriously under-identified. And so that's really the whole premise, that if you start kind of identifying students here at the earlier levels, before the fire's blazing out, more
And like you
focus
said, more
on
subtle.
Exactly.
It's going to be a little harder to
earlier
identify.
on.
Yeah.
Exactly. So
But more effective to identify early before they
Absolutely, at the tier 2 level. Hopefully you'll have less fires to put on later on. Of course, the challenge is that everyone has those fires. You know, ask any principal or assistant principals who's spending 75% of their time dealing with these fires, but you have to spend some time downstream, you know, or upstream, you know, to get to these students before maybe the fire's burning out of control. And then really that risk is, you know, RTI that you heard tiered support was really based on academic risk. And then you heard positive behavior supports takes into account more behavior and social emotional. And that really, and you saw that in the Diary of a Teenage Dropout, risk is really related. You have to look at that between all of these buckets. It might start first in attendance and then go into academics or behavior or vice versa, but they are very related. Yeah.
Well, thank you for showing that. So really we get down though to how can you identify students? I mean, it sounds like you need some pretty sensitive data collection. You need to really have some good indicators or some good way to figure out what those indicators are at what levels and what are you going to look for, and make sure you have something to do about it once you've identified.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one thing, you know, what I'll kind of talk generally, and I'll show you a picture, but that what we're seeing in terms of when we're looking at how risk manifests itself is that it's key to have indicators across multiple buckets. So attendance, behavior, academics, you know, demographics, you know, might be mobility, might be a factor, and so forth like that. And so that if you pick 2 or 3 indicators, how do you know you're picking the right ones?
And some of them might overlap. I mean, if you did 2 academic, you're going to maybe pick up the same issue.
And a lot of times maybe later on, right? As you saw that in the Diary of a Teenage Dropout, by the time it reached the academics, there were a lot of other signs of risk before it got to that point. And really a big thing is what we've seen is that when we look at the relative importance of predictors, attendance is in virtually 100% of the districts we worked with in the top 10. And so what's that say? That a precursor, you know, you have to get the students there and present in the classroom. And that's a precursor that eventually shows up in academics. So, so again, if you're talking early warning, a lot of times it'll show up in these other areas first before it gets into that. But a lot of schools kind of, you know, their criteria, like I said, varies. So maybe it's, you know, academics, and if they're performing 2 grade levels below, maybe that's their threshold. And you know, that's good. But a lot of times there have been a lot of signs before that, and a comprehensive system is going to look at that across the way. So I think the key is the multiple buckets. But I can kind of talk a little bit, if you want to, like about early warning systems and how that has progressed.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, because there does seem to be there has been that report you were talking about from the Department of Education was in the 90s, right? Late 90s. So I think that was some groundbreaking idea of thinking how to think about it as an early warning. But there've been some more sophisticated ways to use that information and gather it and apply it. Right. So.
Well, you're right. I mean, at the point when we look at the evolution of early warning, kind of the first generation were these kind of checklist models, and they were a huge development, like you said. It put a focus on being proactive rather than reactive. You know, it was research based, looking at, okay, when we do the research, what are the factors that have historically been associated with a higher likelihood of dropping out? It's systematic and consistent, so you don't have that variability across schools and everyone having their own internal criteria of what's risky or not. And all of those things.
You're singing the song of the National Dropout Prevention Center. That's why we have prevention in there. It has to be systemic. I mean, we certainly do work in this area and support this kind of thinking. So
prevention and systemic and early intervention. That's key.
Early. So it's really interesting to see the development of some of these systems that can help us identify and do this.
Absolutely. So I mean, the first generation was huge that way because, you know, organizations such as yourself and then these developments really put the focus on proactive.
Early
you know, none of these
prevention.
major negative events happen out of a vacuum. Most of the time after they happen, people are like, oh yeah, I knew something was up with that student. So So that was a huge development. That's it. There are also some limitations to it, as with any methodology.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So one thing, as you can see, is it's very it's threshold based. So basically, for example, this is a typical kind of checklist model, you know, that they have. And so perhaps if students are missing 10% or more of days, they hit that threshold, then they're at risk, or they're not. So what that is it treats risk as a dichotomous phenomenon.
Right.
So it's
either
like
risky or not, at risk or not.
Yeah, yes, no, exactly,
Right.
risky or not. But as you saw in that diary of a teenage dropout, that's really, risk is a continuum.
It is, right.
You know, I mean, when I looked at that diary of a student who eventually dropped out of 10th grade, could I really say at which point?
Yes, right.
He was like, okay,
No.
today he's risky, yesterday he wasn't. It really doesn't work like that.
Full of a lot of subtleties. And
Exactly.
a lot
It's
of
a continuum.
interconnections and
There are different levels of risk, and it's a continuum, you know. The other thing is that the thresholds that were used and have been used for that were primarily established at the higher grade levels. So it's based on research done at, you know, high school level.
Right, it's where
But
they had the data.
It's where they
to
have the
connect
data
it to
available.
dropping out or
Exactly. But then it's inappropriately applied to the lower, the same threshold to the lower grade levels. So, you know, and what you saw on that diary is that you know, what's risky for a third grader is not the same as what's risky for a ninth grader. So, for example, in one district that I worked with, perhaps, and you'll see variations, but it's been very consistent. Maybe if we look at the students who eventually dropped out in that district, maybe they had about a 94% attendance rate in third grade. And you're like, oh, that's fine. It certainly wouldn't hit this threshold. But when you compare that to the students who eventually graduated, it's about 3% below that. So for a third grader, that's actually pretty risky.
Very, yeah.
And you look at what ultimately happens to those students in
Yeah.
terms of positive or negative outcomes.
And I know we're going here with this presentation, so I can't wait to get there. It was, you know, how do you set those more definitive threshold, more appropriate, I guess.
Take into account
yeah.
kind of
Yeah,
how
and
risk is different at the different levels.
And levels, and even school settings and parts of the country and districts, and you know, there's got to be such variation as to what's going to be a very risky.
That's
you
a
know,
good point, because
yeah.
the other thing, the limitation of this one is that it's like a one size fits all.
Oh,
Right?
right.
And so what you just said is that there is a lot of variation, what we've seen with our work here, across districts. So even though research, for example, has found that mobility is related to dropping out, in one district that might be a really important predictor or factor, and
Yeah.
in another district it doesn't even play into the picture.
Yes.
And there are
Yeah.
other factors
That's a
that are
good
much more
example.
important. And so even though, you know, the general research says that, how that applies in your own setting can vary, as well as, you know, how it applies to students in different grade spans varies. So that's a big one. The other thing is that a lot of times it's limited to a few indicators. So you know, because out of practicality, how can you monitor all of those? And so did you pick the right indicators?
Yes, right.
And a key to me, the other thing is communication is really key. You know, so if you're giving this information in a bunch of spreadsheets, you know, it's you got to pay attention to that side, and
There's no subtlety in the spreadsheets.
you got to make it easy for people to
Yes,
use and act upon.
that too, right.
And that kind of related to the other key one is accuracy. So while it was more accurate than what we found is like the first generation, while more accurate than kind of subjective internal criteria, it did still have a tendency to have a lot of false positives, which means you're throwing a general net. So you're identifying a lot of students who aren't really at risk. So a lot of times what came out of students who have used kind of checklist approaches is that it just told me that
Everybody's at
at risk.
Yeah,
And you're like,
yeah.
how do I use this information?
90%, yeah,
You know, I don't
whatever.
even know what to do with this.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's good example. So kind of what's been moving on with in terms of the evolution of early warning, it's kind of like, you know, laptops when they were really big and heavy and clunky and
Right.
expensive. And you always want to make them kind of get smaller, lighter, faster,
Less expensive.
less expensive, right? Same thing with early warning. You wanted to get more accurate earlier
Yes.
and kind of address that. So So there's been an evolution. So kind of the next generation of early warning that we've seen has really relied on predictive analytics. So you're using a combination of research-based indicators that all the research out of 20 years has shown are related to dropping out. And then it's also data-driven. So you take that and you look at, okay, who historically has dropped out or graduated in your district? And what were the most important predictors or factors?
So it's more
Related to that.
contextualized, and then you
Absolutely.
can also look at what those factors were in the third grade.
Absolutely. So let me look at the students who have historically dropped out in your district, and what did they look like at the third grade? You know, and then it takes into account the amount of data available. It automatically kind of customizes it to your district and to your grades. It also relies on the other benefit of that approach is you can look at multiple indicators across multiple domains. So that's key. You want to. What we've seen is that your accuracy in being able to predict students who are eventually going to drop out increases exponentially when you have multiple indicators in multiple buckets. And by that, we're not attendance, behavior, academics, and things like that.
So there's a multiplier effect, sort of, or there's some interaction.
It's going to be far more sensitive,
more-
right? Because where the risk of first shows up might be vary according to individual student. And so, so we've seen that your accuracy rates increases tremendously. So it's
Yeah.
far more accurate. And by accurate, I mean, we can actually look at the students who eventually dropped out and graduated and said, how many of those would have been accurately identified? So it's
You
not
can
like
test
a,
the-
oh, absolutely,
yeah,
you can look at it. So it's not like this, you know,
You're
hypothetical,
just guessing that this is it,
hypothetical
yeah.
thing. You can actually look at how good your
Yeah.
early warning systems
Prove
were,
it.
and so so we've seen that the accuracy rates have gone up exponentially, and of course you can identify earlier, and so that's really key, you know. Then the other part is that what we've seen with early warning systems is that there have been advances in communication. So where you're displaying risk as a continuum.
Yeah.
You know, basically, so, and then also on different levels. You know, so, you know, at the indicator level, at the domain level, and overall risk. Because a lot of times it's how those, beyond those indicators, it's how they work together. So it's the cumulative profile of a student. Not, so if, you know, they're having low attendance with low academics that are most indicative of risk. So you look at them as a whole.
And also, is there also been more of an evolution to get this information right to the teachers, right in their room on their laptop?
I think
know?
that's key,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, so it's funny, researchers like myself, you know, we get a little geeked out on all the analytics behind it and be like, well, isn't this, look how good the research is behind this. And, but the truth is, there's a tendency, we don't pay enough attention on communication and dissemination.
Right.
And the truth is, you can have the best research in the world, the best, you know, early warning platform in the world, and the research behind it, predictive analytics. But if you don't put that in a form that's really easily accessible and usable,
Usable.
by connected to action and what you can do,
Good point.
you're not going to get the impacts out of it.
Yeah.
And so
So the connection to action also has evolved.
it's really key. And
Yeah,
you know,
and-
that's also related to being to accuracy. Because if you're just saying, okay, you have 300 out of your 400 students are at risk, and you have no way of differentiating, you know, levels or degrees, it really doesn't facilitate action.
Yeah.
Versus if you have a more nuanced system, where you know, where you're really that's more accurate, where you're really identifying those students who are truly at risk, and you also have degrees that you can show that. Then it allows a district or a school, it makes it more to prioritize and decide, you know, when, at which point they're going to, you know, introduce services and all
Yeah.
that.
Oh, yeah. I can see
So
that.
it makes it more manageable. You know, an example of this actually is Jack. This is like a pseudonym for a fifth grader. But if you look at this, you know, Jack, like fifth grade, this is kind of what all his data is looking like. So he's had 91% attendance, 80% in the first 30 days, a 3-point, you know, sorry, my eyesight is going 3.7%.
Yeah, we'll have to zoom in on this.
On tardies, 1 suspension, 2 minors. slightly below, on some of his academic performance. You can see Jack's profile. And this one state we worked with had a checklist approach. And they had three indicators that they used as checklists. One was that attendance needed to be 90% or below, 10% of days, two suspensions or more in a 12-month period, and GPA less than 2.0. It also, in this particular state, it only kicked in until in 9th grade, so it really wouldn't have applied to Jack anyway. But as you can see, using that checklist model, Jack wouldn't be flagged as being at risk. But cumulatively, looking at his risk, would you say he's risky?
Okay.
For a 5th grader, if you look at it all as a whole.
Yeah.
So you have these students who may not hit the threshold in any single area, but cumulatively, they're pretty risky.
Oh, yeah.
So Jack's pretty risky right here. And this is where, using the predictive approach, you can show how you can provide information on indicator risks, risk at an indicator level, at a domain level, within the domain of attendance or behavior, academics, and then overall.
So there's some cumulative analysis there.
So like the overall is more like a full-blown cold, right? But you also want to have the information as well where you can have,
actually apply
just like a
some
sniffle here.
Yeah,
They're starting to show more subtle signs. Exactly.
And know what to prescribe.
I think that's really the next step. Is what do you do with that information?
Digging down into that. I had I want to talk to you about caveats on thinking about identifying students. You always hear about this person beat the odds. This person had all the indicators, but still somehow managed to be successful, or the other way around. There was absolutely no indicator at all, and then all of a sudden something happens. So I know we need to say we need to be careful with this kind of these systems and the use of them.
Sure. The one thing that I will say is, in the vast majority of cases, there are usually always warning signs. Now, the hard thing is when you look at risk, you saw on the slide, risk is multidimensional. So it's so there's a strong relationship between all these different areas of risk. So attendance, behavior, academic performance, life characteristics, if they're homelessness, teenage pregnancy, mental health, substance use, these are all related. Right? And in the vast majority of cases, there are warning signs. The interesting thing is, you'll hear people talk about these life factors, so a lot of these basic needs, they can really influence a student's likelihood of being, academic success or failure. And a lot of times you don't have direct measures of a lot of those to use in their early warning systems, right?
Right.
What we do see, though, is even though all of these factors might be going on, eventually it does tend to show up in the data that is commonly available in schools. So it will eventually show up even though all these things are happening in the background.
Yeah, and you wish you would have been able to do something earlier, but you just don't have that data.
Right.
But something's going to show up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if it's a
and the earlier
homelessness
the better,
issue, maybe it's
then
going to be attendance and things like that. And so usually the vast majority of cases, there are signs ahead of time. But I think what your point is really important on, looking at the potential kind of what is at risk, what is not, and that, what's the appropriate use of that. I think that's, so really when we're talking about risk and what's at risk, it's really, it's a likelihood or a probability, So for example, that when historically when we've looked at other students who have graduated or dropped out or who have dropped out in your setting, they had these kind of characteristics at this point in time. So that there's, that basically it shows that there's an increased likelihood that these things are going to happen, but it certainly does not imply certainty.
Not certainty.
Exactly.
Right.
It's not a foregone conclusion. And that's the big thing. It's not like you're labeling them.
Yeah, that's, I guess, what's getting
here,
to. Right.
second grade, I'm labeling you, you're going to drop out.
Right.
No. You're just saying, you know what, you're showing some signs that have historically been associated with an increased likelihood of dropping out.
Let's see if we can support you.
The purpose is to promote early intervention and support so as to alter a negative trajectory that might be emerging. And so just as risk factors raise the chance of poor outcomes, protective factors raise the chance of positive outcomes.
Right.
So really what you're trying to do then is like, okay, we're going to embed some protective factors here.
Which are always good. Even if you got it off a little bit, and then maybe that wasn't going to be the outcome in the probability-wise, something may have happened. But supportive factors and supportive.
Those protective
protective,
factors are really important. So you hear of these students who came from all these risky environments and things like that, but yet they beat the odds.
Somehow.
That you can do that. You can alter that, but the school does have or the community has some control over putting into place protective factors. And I think that's the key. And when you saw that Diary of a Teenage Dropout, I mean, you can see that trajectory. It was a long trajectory of where you saw that students starting to get progressively more disengaged from school. And so some timely intervention and embedding of those protective factors, maybe you could have changed that trajectory. In that case, all those students eventually dropped out, so it continued to go spiral downward. But maybe if you would have embedded some of those protective factors early on, you could have changed that trajectory. So I think that's really important. The other part is, it's an interesting climate where sometimes, where there was a point in time where people are like, oh gosh, if I identify students and I have to do something. I'm on the, it's a little scary and things like that, but
Now what?
But the thing is that there's been actually a lot of legal precedents lately too, that if you reasonably should have known that something was up with a student and you showed deliberate indifference, then you're legally liable.
Right.
Let alone that it's the right thing to do.
There have been some cases.
And it's affecting everything in your school, including climate and academics and everything else.
So it's important. It's important for the school to have not only the identification and then something to do about it.
Well, and I think that's where your organization comes into place. I think you disseminate a lot of evidence-based practices. Like, okay, these are the evidence-based practices that have been shown to help students, help retain students in school, right? And so I think it's key that you have to have those evidence-based practices, but you also have to have the pipeline to make sure that you're getting those research-based interventions to the students who could benefit from them early enough. And that's the key, not, what we've seen in terms of early warning is, ninth grade, when you looked at the trajectory, obviously you're going to continue to try and do any interventions you can throughout the student's career, including, high school, but that really earlier intervention would have a greater likelihood of having positive outcomes, just before that student is so disengaged,
Mariam, do you have some tips on what a school can do or a school district can do to help if they're using an early warning system in whatever degree of sophistication it is, what can they do to make the data better and to make it work better, make them better able to identify?
Yep. So what I can do is I'll talk about what we've seen are key characteristics to getting the impact out of your early warning system.
Okay.
But one of the things you brought up was really key. A common thing that I've really seen is when you look at how risk tends to manifest itself, one of the areas that it really shows up in is behavior. So one of the first areas that it might show up in are behavior.
Right.
But when you talk about one of the kind of garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have good behavioral data, how that's you might be missing some major signs going on. So
for example.
Okay, an example. So there were we did some research with where we were using predictive analytics in this early warning systems in 2 districts that were really exactly the same. If you looked at their profile, the demographics of their students, all of these different characteristics, they were exactly the same. One district had virtually no behavioral data until 6th grade. So when I looked at the number, when you look at, and by behavioral data we're talking about minor and major behavioral incidents, suspensions and expulsions, although those tend to come into play more at the middle school level and beyond. So up K-5, 0.02% of their students had any behavioral incidents or anything like that. And then you got to middle school, 6th grade, and 30% of their students had majors. So it went from 0 to 30.
Oh my.
Right?
Yeah.
So most likely, it's not like they all suddenly
of a
had
sudden.
major behavioral incidents at 6th grade.
Right.
They had a lot of little things going on for years before,
right.
but you had no information on it.
Right.
And the interesting thing is, this was you hear a lot of districts, like this that have very poor quality behavioral data, but a lot of them are implementing positive behavior supports.
I want to get to your last slide, and I
So-
also want to tell our viewers that we're going to put these slides,
Absolutely.
your PowerPoint, up on our website so that they can go back and review and get more into the dig deeper.
Absolutely.
And also some resources that you will send us that will be
Absolutely.
connected to this. We'll put that up on the Dropout Prevention webcast page.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's the last one on kind of key characteristics. If you're putting into place an early warning infrastructure, accuracy is key. Are you really identifying those who are truly at risk? And are you not, given that you have limited resources, you don't want to devote resources to students who really aren't? Early is key, and multidimensional. That to be more accurate and early, you have to be looking at multiple indicators across multiple buckets. Attendance, behavior, academics. Personalized adaptive, so it's not one size fits all. Has to, that what's risky for a 3rd grader, or 5th grader is different from what's risky from a 10th grader.
Okay. They really need to dig into their own data and see that too for their setting. Okay.
Research based, that this, if you, to the extent that you leave it to be subjective criteria, everyone has their own concepts of what risky is, and it's a way that kids can fall through the cracks. The communication of that information needs to be in a way that's conducive, for action.
To actually use it.
And also to the underlying phenomenon. So risk is a continuum. Levels of risk is much better than a yes/no. And differentiation is key. So it has to yield, any early warning system has to yield manageable number of students that you can actually act upon.
I understand.
And prioritize.
Yeah.
Then the other part I'd say, this comes into that if you can, there has to be built-in referral and follow-up mechanisms. So that, if you're saying, okay, these ones are showing signs of risk, what happens now? And that they don't go into the black box, so you don't know what happens to them and so forth. And then similarly, monitoring that they actually get connected to services, what they get, and then monitoring their risk levels over time to see whether the impact of those services. So
you have worked so much in this area and are such an expert, and we loved having you on today. Would you allow people to contact you if they have other questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we're going to put your contact information up also then as well, and people can email you because you've got such a wealth of information and knowledge and insight to share.
Thank you.
And
I think a
thank
lot of people out there have experienced similar
Yeah.
experiences as well as
It's a
yourself as well. So
Well, thank you, Mariam.
thank you.
Thank you for being on
Right.
our show.
Wow, Karen, I think our viewers can see why this is such an important program and information that they really must know if they really want to do dropout prevention.
It is, and I want to remind the viewers that there are resources on the Dropout Prevention website where they can go for more information on this.
Yes, I think those resources are really important for good professional development so they can take this program today and go forward to making some change in their schools. But if you want to talk about it, there's that discussion board. Remind everybody about the discussion board on the website. And then there's one other thing to remind them about. The master of tweets is Karen Withington.
Right. We can continue to have a discussion about this on the discussion board, also through Twitter at NDPCN, #earlywarning, and that will give us a thread where we can talk about this, and also talk with us on our Facebook and keep us in the loop on what's going on out there and how we can help in this area.
Right. Well, I think it's been a terrific program, a great start to On the Road, and we look forward to the next time. So we look forward to all of you joining us for the next time for Solutions to the Dropout Crisis.